The 1990s were a transformative decade, the first time in half a century that the world did not have to worry about the threat from the Soviet Union. Technology advancing to the point where personal computers and the Macintosh became mainstream, and people started hooking up to the World Wide Web. It was also a decade where some new coaster manufacturers burst onto the scene and changed the industry for the better. These are the most important coasters of the 1990s. First, let's look at 3 honorable mentions. Space Mountain at Disneyland Paris was important for the park. It was a major investment that the new park desperately needed to boost attendance. This was an elaborate indoor inverting launch coaster that has been rethemed several times over the years, but it still stands today. The world's tallest coaster changed hands a few times in the mid-90s. 1994 saw it broken twice with aerodynamics. First with Desperado at Buffalo Bills Resort and Casino, and then shortly after with Pepsi Max Big One at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. And then Togo took the title with Fujiyama at Fuji-Q Highland. Smashing coaster records would be a theme in the 90s, just like steroid-era baseball. Finally, the Din Corporation opened a pair of wooden coasters that were revolutionary for their time. The massive Texas Giant at Six Flags Over Texas in 1990, and then Mean Streak at Cedar Point in 1991. These would grow old and outdated and become the first RMC hybrid conversion in 2011, and then the first RMC Hyper Hybrid conversion in 2018. Number 15. Dragon Con at Port Aventura in Spain. The 1980s was dominated by the inversion record being broken pretty much on a yearly basis. Shockwave at Six Flags Great America broke the 7 inversion barrier in 1988, and then it seemed like 7 was the magic number for all of the major loopers that came after that. But 7 years later, B&M and Port Aventura took the next step with Dragon Con, featuring 8 inversions. It wouldn't be until 2002 that we would see that record be broken, with Colossus at Thorpe Park, which hit 10 inversions. But Dragon Con is the coaster that can claim that it broke through that 7 inversion barrier. Number 14. Flight of Fear at Kings Island and Kings Dominion. Coaster launches had been evolving ever since the late 70s, with the flywheel and the weight drop, but in 1996, Premier Rides introduced something that hadn't been seen up to this point, a magnetic launch using linear induction motors, or LIMs. This new technology would be the wave of the future when it came to reliable and consistent launch coasters. But the LIM technology would fizzle out after about 16 years. Number 13. Kingdom Coaster at Dutch Wonderland. This is a pretty small-scale coaster that opened in 1992, and most of you have probably never heard of it. But it was the debut coaster of Custom Coasters International, or CCI, a company founded by the daughter of the legendary coaster designer Charles Din the year prior. Dutch Wonderland gave CCI its first break, and they would go on to have a very prosperous decade, building 34 coasters all over the world before going bankrupt in 2002. These coasters range from large-scale coasters for major chain parks to scaled-down models for smaller parks. Lots of small parks around the US have a CCI wooden coaster from the 90s as their main attraction. Number 12. Bizarro at Six Flags Great Adventure. This opened as Medusa in 1999, and it looked like a pretty basic B&M Mega Looper like Dragon Con. But Medusa featured the very first floorless trains. Instead of having your feet sit flat on the floor, riders' legs would dangle above the track, giving them the sense of openness and danger. The floorless coaster would be wildly successful for B&M over the next 6 years, but eventually it would fizzle out, with 13 installations featured the very first floorless trains. Instead of having your feet sit flat on the floor, riders' legs would dangle above the track, giving them the sense of openness and danger. The floorless coaster would be wildly successful for B&M over the next 6 years, but eventually it would fizzle out, with 13 installations around the world. Number 11. Volcano the Blast Coaster at Kings Dominion. In 1998, Intamin took advantage of those LIMs from Flight of Fear and put them on a coaster that was completely unprecedented, the suspended coaster. Volcano was the first coaster to feature a launch where the train hung under the track. All it took was 20 years of launch coasters before someone branched out and decided to propel an untraditional kind of coaster. at speeds of 70 miles per hour nonetheless. Intamin was known for their innovation, and this is certainly not the last time that you'll see them on this list. But with great innovation comes great problems, and Volcano was shut down and removed in 2019. Number 10. Oblivion at Alton Towers. I don't know why B&M just didn't outright make this the first 90-degree angle. I know that Oblivion was not the first vertical coaster, officially, but in spirit it was. Oblivion was the first B&M dive machine. Alton Towers has a strict height limit, but they also have a drive to build the best and most innovative coasters, so they need to be creative. Nobody had ever seen a coaster like Oblivion before, hanging riders straight down over the edge and dropping them at a near vertical angle. Oblivion only stands 65 feet tall, but it drops its riders into a massive tunnel, so its drop is actually 180 feet. The dive machine has become a very popular model for B&M and is a big draw for the general public everywhere it's installed, making it a popular choice for parks around the world. Number 9. Apollo's Chariot at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Up until 1999, B&M had just built inverting coasters, but they took the next step and took their big, graceful inversions and turned them into big, graceful camelbacks. They replaced their hard over-the-shoulder restraints with a clamshell lap bar, and they had a winner on their hands, the Hypercoaster. The concept wasn't new. Arrow, Morgan, and Togo had been churning them out over the last decade, but the B&M model would take over as the preferred hyper in the industry, and 18 more would be built, including a trio of coasters that would break the 300-foot barrier more than 10 years later. Number 8. Great White at SeaWorld San Antonio. For the first 33 years of SeaWorld's existence, they were all about animal exhibits and shows, along with a small ride here and there. As the first coaster war was heating up in the late 90s and everyone was adding the biggest and best coasters, SeaWorld saw that their 4 parks in California, Ohio, Florida, and Texas could be left behind if they did not throw their hat into the ring. They broke the ice with Great White, a B&M inverted coaster that has the same model that Six Flags uses for their Batman the Ride clones, and they would never turn back. All of SeaWorld's parks have multiple major coasters now, and with their shift away from animal shows in recent years, their reliance on coasters is even greater. Number 7. Kumba at Busch Gardens Tampa. When B&M got started, they were focusing on smaller models. These would all stand around 100 feet and stand on compact cookie-cutter plots of land. But in 1993, they kicked it up a notch. They introduced a 143-foot-tall, 7-inversion mega looper called Kumba, featuring almost 4,000 feet of track. Unless you're the Gravity Group, you can't always start big. You have to build your skills and keep getting better and better. And Kumba represented the future of B&M, and it's still a beloved coaster to this day. Number 6. Big Thunder Mountain at Disneyland Paris. When Disneyland Paris opened in 1992, its one coaster was a mine train called Big Thunder Mountain, reminiscent of the same ride that you can find at other Disney parks. But this one was built by Vekoma, a company that had battled Aerodynamics and Schwarzkopf in the 70s and 80s for supremacy in the amusement industry. By the early 90s, they were still a major player, but they were about to get buried by the new Swiss manufacturers flooding the market with far superior models. But Big Thunder Mountain was the first time that Vekoma would work with Disney, a relationship that would save Vekoma over the next 2 decades. Vekoma would have a successful run with their boomerangs, suspended looping coasters, and other loopers for a while, but there wasn't a market for that once the 90s were over. But there was still one company hiring Vekoma for their major projects, Disney. Without Disney's patronage for rides like Rock 'n' Roller Coaster, Expedition Everest, and Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, maybe Vekoma does not make it through their rough patch to emerge as a major player again over the last 5 years with their new style that has a promising future. Number 5. Wildcat at Hershey Park. I talked about CCI earlier. Well, one of the designers from CCI broke off to form their own company in 1994 called Great Coasters International, or GCI. Hershey Park would give GCI their first project, a coaster that would open in 1996 called Wildcat. Wildcat would represent what GCI would become, mid-sized wooden coasters that feature a twisted layout with lots of crossovers and lateral forces. Since 1996, GCI would never look back, building 29 coasters worldwide and being the go-to company for wooden coasters. Even with the demise of CCI, the emergence of Gravity Group, as well as RMC, GCI is still the top wooden coaster manufacturer in the world. Number 4. Ride of Steel at Six Flags Darien Lake. Intamin Amusement Rides started making coasters in 1979, but it wasn't until the late 90s that they would transform into the manufacturer of the best thrill rides in the world. One that opened everyone's eyes was the first mega coaster in 1999, then known as Superman Ride of Steel at Six Flags Darien Lake, a non-inverting hypercoaster standing 208 feet tall, having more than a mile of track, and having massive helices and airtime hills. The mega coaster is still a staple of Intamin's ride catalog, and this would be the same concept that led to the first ever Giga Coaster, Millennium Force at Cedar Point, just a year later. Number 3. Superman Escape from Krypton at Six Flags Magic Mountain, and Tower of Terror at Dreamworld. Speaking of Intamin, when it comes to their first major modern thrill project, we have to go back to 1996 when they looked to crack the 100-mile-per-hour barrier. They would do this with their reverse freefall model with 2 installations, Superman the Escape at Magic Mountain, as well as Tower of Terror in Australia. These would use a brand new type of magnetic launch, the Linear Synchronous Motor, or LSM. After being delayed for a season, both of these opened up to the public in early 1997, and would use those LSMs to propel the train gradually to 100 miles per hour before launching up a massive vertical spike. Superman clearing 400 feet, and Tower of Terror topping out at 377 feet. The LSM launch would become the launch system of choice, as LIM and hydraulic launches were phased out, and air launch coasters are still pretty rare. Most new coasters with a launch will utilize LSMs, which were introduced with these reverse freefall coasters. Number 2. Batman the Ride at Six Flags Great America. Before 1992, there were some suspended coasters out there, but they never flipped riders upside down. There was a thought that it couldn't be done, especially with the swinging cars popular with the aerodynamic suspended model. But B&M, still a brand new company, took the project on. They introduced their inverted coaster model with Batman the Ride at Six Flags Great America, using a rigid, fixed seat that was capable of turning upside down. A truly revolutionary accomplishment that would be replicated by other manufacturers in the future, including Vekoma and Intamin. These companies existed prior to B&M, but it was B&M that got the job done. Number 1. Iron Wolf at Six Flags Great America. I spent a lot of time talking about B&M here. In fact, this is the 8th B&M on this list, meaning that more than half this list is made up of B&Ms. That just shows you how influential they were when they burst onto the scene in the 90s. And when we talk about that first big coaster war that hit its crescendo in 2000, B&M was right in the middle of it along with Intamin. Iron Mountain at Disneyland Paris. When Disneyland Paris opened in 1990, ride at Six Flags Great America, using a rigid, fixed seat that was capable of NOLA, who had been supplying rides for Intamin back in the 80s. This is why those Intamin stand-ups from the 80s and 90s look so similar to the first few B&M models. The very